So the last time we got together, we talked about semantics and deception, and this is in contrast to what we talked about previously in terms of nonverbal cues and deception. Now we're getting into verbal cues and deception, and there's a number of categories here to go through and talk about. I'll go through each of these kind of quickly here, but to give you an idea of how each of these gives us the cues that somebody might be indeed trying to deceive us. We'll start with this first concept of mirroring. And you've either done this or you've heard it done, where somebody is accused of a certain type of activity, allegedly. Say, for example, you ask your subject, "Did you take the last cookie out of the cookie jar?" And they say, "Did I take the last cookie out of the cookie jar?" So they're mirroring, or maybe even a better term for this would be parroting. And what they're doing with that is they're stalling for time while their brain goes through and tries to manufacture a viable deception, perhaps about the cookie in the cookie jar. So um, this can get a little bit more serious when we're talking about higher crimes than just stealing cookies. But it doesn't seem to matter. The subject, if they start to mirror you, if they start to parrot you and what it is that you're asking them, it's a pretty safe bet that they're stalling to come up with an alternative story. We have a tendency to speak in contractions. It's something that we do naturally, as opposed to it is something that we do naturally. You're versus you are, didn't versus did not, cannot, and so on, right? So when we are being careful to go through maybe and construct reality, if we're trying to come up with a deceptive story, we have a tendency to not contract. So the lack of contractions within a disclosure or within a deposition might be an indication, a verbal indication that the subject is creating the lie. They're creating the story. Okay, so if we have did not versus didn't, cannot versus can't, shouldn't, and so on, it's one of the most popular ones versus it is. With the lack of contractions, that will at least get my attention that perhaps our subject is not being that our subject is going through and creating perhaps what they think had happened. The more vague the subject is within the descriptions, the more indirect. This might be avoidance as well in terms of coming up with specific terms or times or dates or names or places, anything that might go through and muddy up the waters in terms of our understanding might be an indication as well. The more vague a person is, they could be hiding something. Sounds pretty obvious, but and this also goes back to maybe a baseline with that individual. Are they chatty Cathys or are they vague to begin with? That's something that needs to be determined beforehand. And just the opposite of this is true as well. If somebody happens to be very wordy, very verbose, over detailed, over colorful types of descriptions of what's going on, might be an indication, again, that they are going through and constructing it, because within their verbosity, that also gives them time to go through, stalling the brain a little bit to be able to come up with maybe alternative facts of what's going on. What I do when I get somebody who is verbose, say, for example, I get a declaration that says, well, I parked my car, I got out, I hit the button, and I locked the car, and then I walked into the office and I greeted the secretary. And then after I got past the reception, I went back into my own office where I sat down and I opened up my laptop and I started to work on a spreadsheet when I realized that so and so, a certain employee here, had doctored some numbers on that spreadsheet, and I decided to go through and confront them. Well, that's pretty verbose. And what I would ask them to do is to take that line of events and ask them to repeat it back to me backwards. There, because if it is the truth, that'll be pretty easy to go through and recall. And if it's not, if they're making it up on the spot, it's not too difficult to go through and catch them in the lie. Perhaps you've done this as well. You've gone through and talked about an event where you showed up and you let them autofill. Well, remember the other day when we went to lunch and you ordered a burrito? Oh, yeah, a burrito. So at this point, they're telling you the story. They're filling in the facts that you think you've got. Okay. So while this isn't an out-and-out deception, the person who does autofill allows the person who's doing the questioning to go through and insert the facts. This is an interesting approach in terms of going through and defining whether or not we're getting to the truth. Or you might not know, and you're just guessing perhaps at what that autofill noun or verb or adjective might be as well. So be careful of the person who speaks in blanks. Also be careful of the person who speaks in pronouns. We have some pretty famous Hollywood ideations of this, like it puts the lotion in the basket. When we start speaking in non-gender specific pronouns about somebody, we start distancing ourselves from that subject, and that starts to demand our attention. We could do this on other levels as well, and maybe using the third person pronoun for yourself, where let me clarify that. So if I'm disclosing something to somebody, and instead of saying, well, yeah, that was me who went through and messed up those numbers, instead I say, well, yeah, that was him who went through and messed up those numbers. I start speaking about myself in the third person, as well as using pronouns. Chances are we're getting caught up within some level of deception. And lastly are the articles that we use. We have both definite and indefinite articles in the English language. And we use those to go through and make sure we understand which noun that might be. That is the spreadsheet versus that is a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet being the definite article, a spreadsheet being indefinite. We're not quite sure which spreadsheet that might be. The liar speaks more indefinitely, okay, using the article a versus the article the, as to go through and maybe distance themselves or lessen the concept of culpability that the liar might have with whatever the disclosure might be. So there you go. A few cues, a few semantic cues for verbal cues in terms of catching that nasty deceiver. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.